Hello students, welcome to our first lesson on the course Introduction to Conflict Resolution Processes 1. I'm going to be your facilitator for this course and my name is Antonia Okoye. The topic for today is understanding the concept conflict, and I want you to have this at the back of your mind that this concept is very important in your journey as a peace and conflict resolution or student, because you are going to be coming across this concept in many of your courses, if not all. So let's get to class, and I trust today's lesson is going to be very interesting. So back to class now. As I said, our first lesson is understanding the concept conflict. And we have three objectives for today's lesson. The first is to define conflict. The second is to know the different types of conflict. And the third is to identify the phases of conflict. For us to, start understanding what the concept means, we will first look at what all the words that depict what conflict is. And we know that conflict is derived from the Latin word configere, and it means to strike together. It also means to fight, to struggle with people, to be at battle with others, to have a clash with somebody, to be in contention over something, to have confrontation with somebody, to be in the midst of controversy. It can also mean a quarrel, incompatibility, hostility. It can mean contention as well as being at variance with other people. But what we have to have at the back of our mind is that conflict is a normal phenomenon amongst humans. That is, as far as humans are interacting, conflict will abound, because there is no saint. No human is a saint. If we were all saints, there will not be conflict, and there will not even be need for this course, Introduction to Conflict Resolution Processes. So before we go on to understand what conflict is, or to define what conflict is, we are going to look at the definition as proposed by some scholars. And we are going to review three definitions of conflict so that we can come up with our own definition of what conflict is. And the first definition we are going to look at is that of Verzer et al. Et al. Means and others. And they define conflict as a struggle or a contest between people with opposing needs, ideas, beliefs, values, or goals. And they also define it as incompatibility of subjects' positions. And the second conflict definition we are going to look at is that of Ojo, and it defined conflict as a misunderstanding or an aggressive struggle between two or more opposing individuals or parties. The third conflict definition we are going to look at is that of Mojeku. Mojeku defined conflict as a clash between hostile and opposing elements, ideas, or forces, that it occurs at all levels of human interaction, in homes, in offices, in institutions, in organizations, and it usually occurs amongst groups. So what I can observe in these definitions is that there's an omission. There's a particular type of conflict that is not being addressed in these definitions of conflict, and which I have also observed in many definitions of conflict of many scholars. So I have been able to identify that they did not address a conflict that affects an individual, which is known as a dilemma. And I defined a dilemma as an inability of an individual to take a decision or make choice from a variety of options. So let's look at this photo that I just included to give us clarity on the term called conflict. You will see this is a typical conflict scene. You can see everywhere is disorganized. You can see fire is burning at the background. People are all everywhere. This place is a scene for crime to occur, for people to be harassed, for people to be molested. Innocent people are killed in such scenes as this. Let's look at our second photo. Our second photo shows a scene after a conflict. You can see that cars are burned, businesses are burned, police, are trying to, maintain peace in such an area. So we see this is also a consequence of conflict, that conflict leads to destructions. These other photos also look at conflicts, where people are running away for their lives. You can see them putting their life worth on their head. So conflict leads to what we know as internally displaced persons, because their communities are probably destroyed. So they need to run to the next, community so that they can be saved. You see them holding their children, all their life worth on their heads. This last picture depicts the final, and the ultimate price for violent conflict. You can see a young lad being carried by his friend. You can see that the background, that everything is, the conflict is ongoing. So you see that the ultimate price being paid for a destructive conflict is death. So with this at the back of our mind, I want to come up with a very robust definition of conflict. Taking into cognizance the definitions given by the three scholars that we reviewed earlier, as well as the pictures that we have just viewed. So I'm going to define conflict now as inability of an individual to take a decision or make a choice from a variety of options, and or disagreement between two or more persons or groups over incompatible views, interests, values, if not resolved, can lead to violent destruction and ultimately death. So from this, my definition, I've been able to take care of several things. First, I've been able to take care of conflict that affects an individual. I've been able to address the conflict between two or more persons or groups, and I've been able to identify the causes of conflict, which are views, incompatible views, interests, values, ideas, and lastly, I've been able to address the consequences of conflict, which are uh, violent destruction, as well as death. So with this, my definition, I've been able to take care of all these things. Now, to our next objective in this lesson, which is types of conflict. And we have several types of conflict. The first one we'll be looking at is intrapersonal conflict. Intrapersonal conflict, as I've said earlier, is a conflict that affects an individual. And for example, let's look at a situation where most of us has been at one point or the other in our lives, where we cannot, move forward. We are confused. We don't know the next step to take. This is an intrapersonal conflict that's affecting you internally. Only you. You have goals to meet. You are incapable of meeting those goals. Those are conflicting situation that affects an individual. So this intrapersonal conflict usually leads to what we call depression. It leads to madness, and ultimately it leads to suicide. You see people, they just give up on life. They are tired of their life situation, and they see no hope in the future. So the only thing that is now available for them is for them to take their lives. So the next type of conflict that we are going to look at is interpersonal conflict. That is a conflict between two or more persons. That is a conflict that occurs between maybe siblings, brothers, sisters, you and your friends, colleagues. That is between individuals, and this conflict too can be destructive if it's not quickly nib in the bud. And the next type of conflict we are going to look at is intra-group conflict. It's also known as in-group conflict. That is conflict that is occurring within a particular group. Maybe a group that has different faction, people aligning to a particular faction, and another set of people are aligning to another faction. So an example of such intra-group conflict is that occurred in PDP party at a particular time, where they have two factions within the group, and so people were aligning to some sect and the others in another another group. So the next type of conflict we are going to look at is intergroup conflict. That is conflict that is occurring between two groups. An example is that like that two opposing political parties like APC in Nigeria and PDP. They have different ideologies that they are pursuing, and so this always leads to conflict between the groups. The next type of conflict we are going to look at is national conflict, and this is a conflict that is occurring within a nation. This particular conflict is right within the, like a civil war within the nation. Example, we can look at many examples in Nigeria, like Ife Mudakeke conflict, the Tiv-Ijaw conflict, the Tiv-Jukun conflict, the Urobo-Ijaw conflict, the North Kaduna and Southern Kaduna conflict. So many conflicts to look at, and we can also look at another example is the Boko Haram conflict in Nigeria. So these are all national conflict. It does not involve neighboring conflict. It occurs right inside a particular country. So the next and the final type of conflict is international conflict. The international conflict is a conflict that occurs between two or more sovereign nations. It is usually over ideologies, religious beliefs, and many other things. Example is conflict between Iran, Iraq, Israel and Palestine, Ukraine and Russia. So many conflicts. We even have trade war between China and US ongoing now. So there are several examples to draw from. But what we can observe from these types of conflict is that there are other categories of conflict, like religious conflict, and you'll be wondering, are they not types of conflict? Actually, they are a category of conflict that falls into one of this type of conflict. If we look at religious conflict now, religious conflict can occur as an interpersonal conflict. It can occur between two or more persons. It can occur as a group conflict within a group. Maybe probably you have a party, as I've said, PDP party, and they are cut across religious lines. Some people are Christians, some people are Muslims, and it's causing conflict within the group. And religious conflict can also occur within as an intergroup conflict, that's between two groups. Like as I've said, the Northern Kaduna and the Southern Kaduna, the basis or the main issue of those conflicts is religious conflict. Then religious conflict can also occur as a national conflict, that's within the country, probably the northern region against the southern region. So it depends. And also religious conflict can also occur as international conflict. So also other conflict types, like host and settler conflict. It can fall into any of these type of conflict that I've mentioned. So these are the basic types of conflict. Every other conflict can occur as any one of these. So this brings us to our last objective for this lesson, and we are going to look at the phases of conflict. And the first phase is prelude to conflict, and this involves a lot of things, like coordination. We're coming from different background, coming from different educational background, religious background. All these things are what can give rise to a conflict. The next phase of conflict is known as triggering event, and it simply means that conflict cannot occur on its own. Something must trigger it. So let's take an example. For instance, in a class, the teacher call on a student and say, define what conflict is. And fortunately, the person comes from the south of Nigeria, like for a Yoruba man to be precise, and he tries to define conflict with a very heavy accent. And there's somebody else in the class who is, well educated, speaks English fluently, and he starts laughing and says, okay, see the way he's defining conflict with very thick accent. So the Yoruba man may keep quiet because the teacher is in the class, but I tell you immediately the class is over, he is going to call out the other party, which will now lead to the next phase of conflict, which is initiation phase. This initiation phase is actually where the conflict starts. People will argue, tempers are flaring, people are angry, they argue, they abuse each other. This phase is the actual starting point of conflict. So the next phase of conflict that we are going to look at is differentiation phase. This differentiation phase, at this point, this is the point the parties in conflict will now try to voice out their differences. Okay, why are we in conflict? And they try to, to each person saying their own. I don't like what you have done. I don't like this step you took against me, and it's affecting me. The other party will also air their own view as to what is the cause of the conflict. This differentiation phase will now lead us to the final phase of conflict, which is resolution phase. This resolution phase, is the final phase of conflict, where at this point the parties in conflict have now realized that conflict does not lead anywhere. It does not bring, if it's not quickly addressed, it can lead to destructive consequence. So at this point, they will now look at the different options available to them to resolve this conflict. So they will look at the different types of conflict resolution processes that will be, conducive to solve their own issues. So we have come to the end of today's lesson, and we have been able to, define what conflict is, identify the different types of conflict, and look at the different phases of conflict. So, but before we go, I will leave you with this words, which is that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with it. So we should understand that the fact that there is no conflict does not mean that there is peace. So if there is conflict at times, this conflict can lead to positive outcome, positive consequences, and it's important we know that we are able to, cope with this conflict to bring about a peaceful society. So bye for now. See you soon in the next class.